Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording from our 2021 Elul Learning Series.
This is session 3 of what is now a 4-session series, which does not in any way suggest that we're going to be comprehensive here and get through anything more than a taste of the Rambam's approach to the laws of Teshuvah. Right, you would need a semester of daily study to work through it systematically. What I wanted to do is to introduce it to you, introduce the way the Rambam thought about law and how law applied to this psycho-spiritual notion of Teshuvah, and then see some of the specifics. So I'm going to both share my screen, and you can also open it up based on the link. And if someone comes to the class late and can't see the chat, then we'll post it again. So let me share my screen. Why is that not working? There it is. Okay. Sorry about that. So 2 weeks ago, we did a basic intro to the Mishneh Torah and talked about the placement of why Hilkhot Teshuvah is where it is. It's in sort of the pre-halachic section of a very halachic book. And it's very intentionally not put in the laws of Yamim Noraim to suggest that this is not a seasonal obligation. This is a ongoing, supererogatory, overarching obligation. And then we looked at the first halacha, where he talks about the obligation of a verbal vidui and how significant it is to actually articulate to yourself and to God and to whoever's listening, if it's a personal confessional, what you did wrong. And we spoke about the magic and the wonder of specificity, both of praise and of contrition, right? The difference between I'm sorry and the difference between that and saying, I'm sorry that I said these words to you and I know that they caused you pain, right? There is a massive difference whether the recipient of that is a loved one, a friend, or, as it were, the Holy One. Right, which is why so much of our liturgy in the Yamim Noraim is both like scripted, so it's not specifically a representation of our sins, but it's articulated. Right, when we get to that part of Yom Kippur, we don't say close your eyes and feel sorry. We say make your lips form words that are very specific in terms of the ways that a Jew can sin. Okay, and then we spoke about how this was the case even in the sacrificial era, that even if you were living in an era where you could achieve atonement through sacrifices, they would have meant nothing had they not been included along with a verbal vidui. Okay, and that brings us to the third halacha of the first chapter. I think we did not start this, so let me jump right into it. Okay, and we're going to learn this halacha, and then we're going to learn some of the sources from the Talmud that informed the Rambam's writing here. The Rambam, it's interesting. It's a masterpiece of a work, but he doesn't make a whole lot up, right? He's culling through the entire Talmudic system and the Midrashic system, and he's coming up with his organized set of rules, but it's not like he's just pontificating on what a Jew should do. He's based on Talmudic sources, okay? So we skipped the second halacha, now we're in chapter 1, halacha 3. Bizman hazeh, at this time, and with this time for the Rambam is the 12th century. She'ein Beit HaMikdash Kayam, that we have no temple, and we discussed before how the Rambam writes his book both vis-a-vis those laws that obtain with a temple and without a temple. But now he's saying, since there's no temple, ve'ein lanu mizbach kapara, and we don't have an altar on which atonement can be achieved. Ein sham ela teshuvah. The only thing we have is teshuvah. So when the temple stood, we had two individually obligatory but insufficient things to get us to teshuvah. You had the sacrifice, and then you had the articulation of teshuvah. Now, and one without the other was not enough. Now that we've lost one, right? It's not to say that that you only get half teshuvah without the sacrifice. Remember the Rambam. I don't remember if I said it in this class. I've said it in other classes. The Rambam always thought of the sacrificial system as sort of a transitional object for the Israelites to wean them off idolatry. So he mourns the temple, but he doesn't necessarily mourn the sacrificial system. So now that the sacrificial system is gone, the only way you can get a kapara is teshuvah. right? So it's almost to be saying on Yom Kippur, the only thing that actually makes Yom Kippur is not Yom Kippur. The only thing that makes Yom Kippur, back then, Yom Kippur made Yom Kippur because the sacrifices plus your tshuva. Now that we don't have the sacrifices, Yom Kippur is not Yom Kippur because you went to shul on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is Yom Kippur if you've done tshuva. HaTshuva mechaperet al kol ha'averot. Tshuva brings atonement for every one of your transgressions. Now, this is the part that we're going to linger on because it's fascinating, and I'm going to read it. I want to hear your initial thoughts on it, and then we'll look at some of the back sources. Afilu rasha kol yamav. Imagine a person who was rasha, evil, wicked, sinful, his or her entire life. Va'asa teshuvah ba'acharona. And did tshuva at the very end, when the rabbi was around the bed and saying, we're going to be doing the vidui. That's the same word. The words that you say when someone is dying is vidui, this confessional for what you wished you had done differently in life. Ein mazkirin lo shum davar merisho. You never remind that person a single thing from that person's era of wickedness. Shene'amar, he brings a verse from the book of Yechezkel, Ezekiel chapter 33:12. Rishat harasha. You see how it's the gerund and the noun are the same root here. The evil of the evil things that an evil person does. Lo yikashel ba. Such a wicked person will not fail within it, will not stumble in it. Biyom shuvo merisho. Ezekiel prophesied that on the day that even a rasha, a wicked person, does tshuva, she no longer is weighed down, anchored, or blackened by the previous evil. Right? Some people read this text and find it to be like bizarrely Christological, but then you could ask the question, maybe the Christological notions emerged from a Jewish notion, right? This notion of accepting Jesus at any part of your life, even at the very end, brings you a full portion of the Christian notion of the world to come, right? No matter what you've done until now, simply confess your sins. It's very inquisitional in some ways. Confess your sins, and then all will be well, right? He's saying this is a halachic notion. No matter what kind of rasha you were the entire day, the entire life, if you do tshuva at the end, nothing that you did before can be mentioned to you, halachically. The civil courts might have something to say about that. But halachically, you're clean. Whenever I think of this halacha, I think about the very poignant and powerful scene in the movie Dead Man Walking with Susan Sarandon and Sean Penn, right? The character played by Sean Penn, who's clearly guilty of a horrific rape and murder. He's on death row. And Susan Sarandon is some kind of, she's a nun of some order, and she's assigned to his case. And it's a powerful movie. And what the basic premise is that she cannot save him from the death penalty, nor does she think he doesn't deserve it. We don't really know for sure, but it's not about whether or not the state has a right to execute him. That's an interesting question on the other side. The question is, before he dies, can she get him to say and mean significant for contrition for the awfulness of what he did? And what's implied in the movie is that from her theological perspective, if he does that and it's real, he's still going to die. And the sin is still horrific, but his soul is okay. And he will be with God. I struggle with that movie. I'm compelled by that movie. I'm struggled with the idea. I'm compelled by the idea. The Rambam is saying something close to that. I've been quoting Ezekiel. Let's finish this paragraph, and I want to hear your thoughts on it. Va'atzmo shel Yom HaKippurim, and the very day of Yom Kippur, mechaper l'shavim, the day itself. It's read as brings atonement for those who return, but it really means brings atonement for only those who return. Atzmo shel Yom Kippurim, the actual day of Yom Kippur, brings atonement mechaper only for shavim, only those who have already done shuvah. Shene'amar, as it says in the book of Vayikra, ki vayom hazeh yichaper alechem. To understand how he's using the verse, you have to go into a little longer conversation that we're not going to do, but basically a verse from Acharei Mot that basically says that on that day you will achieve atonement, but only if you've done what you needed to do until before that. Okay, let's pause here. What are some people's initial reactions religious, emotional, psychological, with this Maimonidean idea that he's pulling from sources, that you can be a wicked person your entire life. If you do significant teshuvah at the end, it's still the case that you've done the wickedness, but you're clean. You're never allowed to be, taunted with. Remember when you used to be a wicked guy? It's as if you've been reborn, which again is oddly Christological. Renee and then Denise.
I mean, I think the idea of it is nice, but I can't picture, for instance, somebody who commits murder being forgiven just because he said he was sorry. Mm-hmm. I think it depends. The punishment it depends on the crime, the ones that they forgive, and it depends on the sincerity of the person doing the teshuvah and what the teshuvah actually is. Because, like I said, just saying I'm sorry I murdered somebody just doesn't cut it for me, right? Psychologically or otherwise.
Right. And I think, by the way, the Rambam would say that the kind of teshuvah he's talking about goes way beyond the words "I'm sorry," right? And I don't think he's saying that because the person did teshuvah, they're no longer subject to the punishment that the sin required. What he's saying is, as it were, as if he could speak for God, in the celestial realm, that person has achieved what is required to achieve, and now can move from this point forward with the slate wiped a little bit clean. That's what kapara is, a slate wiped clean. Denise?
So it seems like, in a way, it seems like it almost doesn't line up with some of the other things we know about Rambam and Teshuvah, in terms of like, you have to be really specific, and you have to not only be really specific about what you did wrong, but you have to have a plan that you articulate for how you're not going to do it again. And it's not enough to say, oh, I'm sorry, I ate your lunch every day. It has to be like, I'm sorry, I ate your lunch every day, and I'm going to make you a lunch, and I'm going to eat enough before I leave the house that I'm not hungry and tempted to steal other people's food and all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, this doesn't seem, on the surface, it doesn't seem like this aligns with that. But then I think, like, the only way that I can imagine it aligns with that is if the person is basically saying, I accept that I'm going to be killed, and that's the only way that I'm not going to do these things again. Like, I just don't know otherwise how it all lines up, because he said both of those things.
Right. So a couple of responses, then with Carl and Michael. So number one, this concept in the Rambam applies both to major and minor sins. So it applies to sins where the biblical system would have given you the death penalty. It also, applies to having punched your friend when you shouldn't have punched your friend, right? And so it's easier to think about with the smaller sins, right? That we actually don't want it to be held accountable. Like, do I want every time that I have, spoken the way I shouldn't have spoken to someone who's dear to me in the last year, assuming I've done proper contrition for it, do I want that hanging? Do I think I deserve to have that hanging over my head? Or is it possible in the small ones to actually say, I've done teshuvah, I shouldn't have done it originally, but I did it, I've done teshuvah, and now don't remind me when I yelled at you. I did teshuvah for that. I shouldn't have done it, but I did teshuvah for that. So it makes sense in the smaller categories. You're right. It's harder to make sense of in the larger transgressions that a human being can do, that whose sinfulness has a lasting impact on the other. The other thing I want to say is that the Rambam writes his text, again, similar to the way the Mishnah is written, which often begins with a general principle with the particulars to come afterwards. So we're only in the third halacha of an enormous book. He's going to get to all the specifics about how actually one achieves the full teshuvah he's speaking about here. So he's not saying, if you say, hey, I've done teshuvah, you're fine. He's saying, I want you readers to begin to understand that what you're about to read in tremendous detail about how actually one goes through teshuvah, if you end up doing properly everything that I'm about to tell you have to do, then I want you to know that the system that the Rambam, believe in says it works, and you can move forward from there. So we actually haven't gotten that detail yet. So it seems weird here that he's saying it almost blithely. Do teshuvah and you're fine. No, do the teshuvah using every single step that I'm about to articulate, and I want you to believe that the process is operative. Last point, this might be evocative for some of you of a section in the Talmud which says that once a person converts to Judaism, you may not remind them of their pre-Jewish status, right? It's considered a sin for a Jew to look askance on a non-Jew and say, remember when that mouth ate treif, as it were, right? At that point, you, by reminding the once non-Jew of the things that they did that were kind of transgressive against the Jewish people before they became a Jew, you, the Jew, are the sinner in that situation, right? When someone crosses a spiritual threshold, the tradition believes that they actually have crossed it. It's as if the tradition is against grudge bearing, right? Which is a very hard human thing to do, right? But that notion that when we bear a grudge, we give someone else free real estate in our psyche, right? We give them real estate without rent in our psyche. The Rambam says if the tshuva is real, just as if the conversion is real, it's real. And now you start from that point forward. Carl, Michael, and then Joanna.
Okay, two questions, I guess, occur to me about this. The first is the premise is if you've completed tshuva properly, then we shouldn't remind you of it in the past. But does the completing tshuva properly include the making restitution for the wrongs that you committed? It's going to be a lot easier to forgive and not remind somebody if they made restitution than if they haven't yet.
Right.
And then the second one is, okay, suppose there's a relapse and whatever the bad action they said they were not going to do again does happen again. Yeah, and then obviously it wasn't quite 100% successful to tshuva, and maybe it's appropriate to remind somebody about that.
Good. On your second point, the Rambam would say, well played, and would say, right, that you know, that what's that notion that the only way to know if a pearl is real is if you drop it in vinegar and it disappears, then it was a pearl, right? So the only way to know that the tshuva was real was if that sin never repeats itself, and if the sin repeats itself, then by definition, the tshuva wasn't tshuva gmura. He keeps using this phrase. We haven't gotten to it yet because we're just in the first two paragraphs. Tshuva gmura, complete tshuva, which frankly very few of us ever do for nearly any of the sins that we are responsible for. Means never actually being in a situation where you could be claimed to be guilty of it again. In terms of the first one, the Rambam does indeed speak about restitution, particularly for financial crimes, and he's just still here in the general principle, and that's why those details which are coming to mind are important to think about. He just hasn't gotten there yet. Michael? You're muted, Michael. There you go. Oh, nope, still muted. There you are.
Sorry.
No problem.
I appreciate what you said and recall something that I learned about, going back to what the Rambam says at the beginning. Now we only have tshuva. We don't have the sacrifices. And that the world is built on tshuva. And so everybody, in a sense, has a second chance. I mean, albeit if somebody keeps making the same mistake, okay, that's a problem. And then also, I seem to remember something I learned about one who does tshuva. There is something in the Talmud or Mishnah. Someone who does tshuva is considered to be higher than the sages, in a sense. Or maybe you can clarify that. Maybe I'm not stating it correctly.
Yeah. There are several versions of that concept. There's a concept that says that in some ways the spiritual plane of the person who sinned sin A and did tshuva for sin A is higher than the person who never did sin A, right? Like any individual sin, right? Because the notion is that if you've confronted a depth of your character and effaced it, in some ways you're in the exact same place as the person who never had that deficit. In some ways, because we believe in the process, and the process being illuminating and ennobling, you're, not that it's a competition, but you're a more improved human. You needed the improvement, but therefore you're a more refined human being, right? And this approach, as Michael was alluding to, it's the notion that someone who did something awful, did serious tshuva, and is now to be considered not as if they never did it, but as if they transcended it. In some ways, it's very brutalist. In some ways, it's very optimistic. It's brutalist vis-a-vis the person who was wronged, right? I mean, our headlines are filled every day with very sympathetic victims who are upset that however long a prison sentence is for someone who did something awful, to the victim, it's not long enough. We can understand that. It's just not long enough, right? We've all been there in different ways. The one that comes to mind is when terrorists who've killed innocent Israelis are let out of prison before they're supposed to, right? It's not long enough, as if an extra 3 years would have done something tremendously different, right? But it's also very hopeful in the sense that the system believes that the human being can climb up from wickedness. And if they climb up from wickedness, whether situational wickedness or grand wickedness, and if they really do, then we say to them, the world is available to you. And so is the community, and so is life. So it's a contrast that the Rambam is putting out here in really very few words. We're expanding on it so much more, and I think we're expanding on it properly. But it's a really interesting contrast in terms of its understanding of the human condition. Let's hear Joanna and Rebecca, and then I want to learn a piece of Talmud with you, which is the source from which Rambam derives this halacha. Joanna?
So there's a bunch of thoughts floating through my mind. One is, when you were mentioning that, this really starts as a general and then focuses down up to the specific, there's a piece of me, and maybe because the specific makes us so uncomfortable, that wants to broaden back out to the general again. And the question that I'm asking myself alongside that is, who is this teaching addressed to, right? Because the teaching doesn't say to the you. If you were bad all of your life and you did evil things all your days and you repent, you're okay. So to me, this reads as this is being addressed to all of us, because none of us, of course, are that such evil person who is observing this in the world. And therefore, if it's addressed to, most of us who are somewhere in the middle, what's the message there? And I think the message there is sometimes the world can seem very dark, and hold out hope for everyone. And this reminds me a little bit, as we were reading through this, I had a flashback to a memory of, I think, somewhere in my teenage years, where during the break on Yom Kippur, there was a very respected, learned member of the community it just happened that as I was kind of walking about past him and turned to him and said, Gemar Chatima Tova. And he said to me, you shouldn't actually say that to anyone on Yom Kippur. And I said, what do you mean? I always learned that this was the greeting for this one day for Yom Kippur. And he taught me that it's really a greeting for Aseret Teshuvah, because everyone who is super righteous, their fate is sealed on Rosh Hashanah. All of the super wicked, their fate is sealed on Yom Kippur. And all of us who are in the middle are decided in the middle days. So to say Gemar Chatima to someone on Yom Kippur is to say to them, in essence, that they are like a super wicked person. And there's something quite beautiful in that teaching of holding out hope that, we're kind of all in this in the collective somewhere in the middle, and let's hold out hope for humanity.
Right. Lovely. So I'm not going to wish you Gemar Chatima Tova on Yom Kippur, because I figure you already finished your tshuva process, right? So I'm gonna praise you by not greeting you in that way. I love that. Wonderful. Rebecca?
My reaction to this part is that it feels like it's almost too easy, in that I always think, probably from school days, I think of Yom Kippur as like a day in court. And it's always difficult to prove in court that you didn't do something. And so it feels like there's more of an effort on the people who hadn't done something clearly evil to figure out what they did wrong and whether they did wrong or not. And while it seems almost easier to just say, yeah, I screwed up and I'll try not to do it again and move on. So I feel like the process for for a really black and white wrongdoing seems almost easier than for something in the middle. Like, like proving that in Hebrew you say, prove that you don't have that sister or that did something or so it just seems a little bit too light on that balance.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Rick. I heard most of those words. The sound went in and out, so I may have missed just a few of the nuances. It's echoing what someone said before. I think it was Carl, maybe it was someone else, that, is it as easy as the Rambam is suggesting here? And I give a similar response: is the question is, would one think that once one finished the entire Hilkhot Teshuvah, right? He's setting up general principles, and then he's going to walk you through the steps. But I recognize why it seems facile. I don't think he means it that way, but I recognize how it comes off. Let's leave the Rambam for a moment and study some Talmud together, because the Rambam is basing this particular notion of a wicked person who did Teshuvah no longer being able to be reminded of their wickedness from a medium-sized chunk of Talmud in Kiddushin. I also want to pause and say it's interesting to see how the camera deals with the fan, because Michael, the fan behind your head is so interesting. It's we're clearly seeing it differently than it is. It has something to do with how many frames per second you're seeing it. So it looks like at least from my camera, it looks like the fan is like tick, 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 like a sprinkler, but clearly it's not what it's doing. So the technology is interesting. Okay. 40th page of Kiddushin.
In Texas, you need a fan.
Yes. There's an interesting, just random Adam Kligfeld coincidence about this page. Some of you know that I did not go to day school growing up. I had a good, Jewish life and culture background from Ramah and USY, and I knew Hebrew. We went to Israel a lot. I was studying Jewish history in college, but I had never studied text. I never studied Rashi or Talmud or anything like that. And I took a semester in college and went to yeshiva to harness my Hebrew skills and learn how to study text.
Rabbi Kligfeld talking.
I think someone's unmuted. Okay. And the way it works in the yeshiva that I went to, and it's probably very common, is that you kind of come when you come. It's not like the session begins on a particular day. Just come and join a shiur. And there's something called the Hamasechet HaNilmedet, the tractate of Talmud that's being studied. And that year, in the yeshiva that I went to, the tractate of Talmud being studied on different levels by different people based on your skill level was Masechet Kiddushin. And I got there, and we started on page 28 or 29, which deals with the laws of the obligations that a child has towards a parent and a parent has towards a child. We spent a few days on that, and then we jumped to this section. So by randomness, this is the second section of Talmud I ever studied in my life back in 1994. Okay. Yar'eh Adam Atzmo Ki'il Yar'eh. I read the first time. Yar'eh Adam Atzmo Ki'ilu Chatzio Chayav Bechatzio Zakai. A person should see himself or himself as if chatzio, half of that person, were chayav. Chayav here means obligated in the sense of your negative qualities, the things that you owe society. Chayav can mean you're obligated to do a certain thing in a halachic situation. It also means the opposite of being good and being positive. When you go to a beit din, right? The beit din might mechayev orcha, obligate you to a payment or restitution, or might mizakeh orcha, basically say you're the victor in the case. So you should see yourself as if half of you is chayav, half of you is owing, vechatzio zakai. Half of you is owed, half of you is fine, right? Think of yourself in perpetual 50-50. I'm half good, I'm half rotten, right? I'm half laden with mitzvot, and half laden down with a mitzvot that I did not do. Asa mitzvah achat, if you do one mitzvah, ashrav, go you, Happy are you, shehichriya atzmo lechaf zechut, because you have moved the dial to kaf zechut. Now, what's the image here? The image is a balance, right? Like as in weights, right? Remember back then, that's actually how they, doled out, money. They would put the amount of corn or wheat, whatever, on this side, and the amount of metal on the other side, and that's how they determined if it was the right amount. And this might be evocative for you of the Mishnaic idea that you're supposed to judge everybody favorably, dan lekav zchut, judge someone as if the weight is in their favor. So what happens with a balance? If something is perfectly balanced, if you put a grain of sand on one side of it, it's imbalanced. And all you need it to be, according to the Rambam, is a little bit balanced towards zakai, a little bit balanced towards the good. So the Rambam wants to say kind of whatever your status is. And maybe here he's speaking to something that Joanna was saying before, that very few of us are lamed vavnikim, perfect souls, and very few of us are wretchedly wicked who commit murder, idolatry, and incest, right? Most of us are walking along, trying to get through our days, doing mitzvot, stumbling, making mistakes. Therefore, you should force yourself or allow yourself to see yourself in a perpetual state of perfect balance, which means that the next mitzvah I do, it's a little bit Chabadish, the next mitzvah I do might tip my balance towards zakai. So why wouldn't I do it then? Avar avera echat. But think of yourself. He's not saying this dispositively in the sense that that's actually happening in the cosmic system. Think of yourself this way. Yireh Adam. Think of yourself as if the next avera that I do, the next transaction that I do, by the way, this is not the Rambam, this is the Talmud, the next transgression that I do, oilo, the opposite of ashrav, like oi to you, shehichriya et atzmo lekaf chova, because you have switched the balance towards your being an ower in the world. Shenemar, we have it from the book of Kohel, the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 9. V'chote echad yi'abed tova harbeh. One sin, the person who sins once destroys much good. Bishvil chet yechidi shechata oved mimenu tovot harbeh. Because of that one little sin, you couldn't hold yourself back. You couldn't resist. That one sin that you did, you oved, you lost, you destroyed from yourself, tovot harbeh, all of the beautiful things you've done beforehand. We'll get eventually to the specific words that the Rambam is basing his law on, but in some ways it's the mirror image of the law above. The law above said, you're a wicked person your entire life, you do tshuva, and it's real. This one says, imagine yourself that the next sin that you do will cancel out or make people forget about or have you lose the status of the generally good person you were beforehand. A lot's at stake in this moment. And what moment is that? Every moment. He quotes this verse from Kohelet. I wanted to bring you the commentary of Rashi on the verse in Kohelet. Remember that Rashi has a line-by-line commentary on every verse in the Tanakh. Sometimes he skips a verse here and there. And he also has a line-by-line commentary on every line in the Talmud. This is not Rashi's commentary on the Talmud. This is Rashi's commentary on the verse from Kohelet. So what's the verse from Kohelet? It's in bold here. V'chote echad yi'abed tova harbeh. The person who does one sin or one sinner destroys much good. What does Rashi say? Harei shehayu Yisrael mechze tzadikim u'mechze rishaim. Imagine, Rashi says, if all of Israel were half filled with righteous people and half filled with wicked people. Uva echad v'chata, along comes another person and sins, v'asa'an merubim, and makes the sinners the greater category amongst the Israelites, the Jews, than the non-sinners. Nimsa shechichriya et kulam lechova. Rashi, quoting the verse, says, this is not just about your individual constitution, but this is actually the perpetual status of the Jewish people. There are Jews, we know them to be the case, that are very, very focused not only on their own works and deeds, But on others, we would call them sanctimonious and filled with hubris and filled with too much certainty that they know what God's will is, right? And you see it the farther you go into the right wing expression of Judaism. Rashi would say, on some level, yeah, I have to be focused not only on my own deeds but on yours, because you might be the one who's going to tip the balance of the Jewish people towards the Messianic era or away from the Messianic era. I'm both kind of disturbed and compelled by that idea. I'm compelled by the idea of considering the urgency of our deeds, because I think sometimes we sleepwalk through mitzvot and we sleepwalk through life. I'm disturbed by the notion that the balance of all humanity is weighing on my next act. But there's something about it that focuses my attention on doing it the right way versus the wrong way. And Rashi's commentary on Kohelet also finds its expression in the Talmud itself, in the continuation of that text. Let me pause here and see if there are any questions or comments before we go back to the Talmud. I didn't see that, wasn't able to read the chats. Correct. Very good, Joanna, about the two pockets. Yes. Great. Thank you, Michael. All right, let's go back to the Talmud. So we jumped out of the Talmud to look at Rashi's commentary on the verse from Kohelet. And now this is the continuation of that passage in Kiddushin, chapter 40. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Shimon, said, Lefisha haolam nidon achar rubo. Right now that we remember the Talmud's previous statement was that every individual should see themselves as the next sin or the next mitzvah as being the one that determines their fate or their status. The Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, kind of evoking what Rashi is going to say about 800 years after this, that the whole world is judged based on its majority, meaning the majority of the world's deeds. The hayachid nidon achar rubo, and the individual is judged by its majority. Asa mitzvah achat ashrav. If you did one mitzvah, go you, yea you. Shehichriya et atmo ve'et kol haolam lekav zechut. So Rabbi Elazar Bar Shimon expands the previous line, which was just our own personal ledger. Your personal ledger might put you and everyone back into the realm of zechut, of being deserving. Avar avera echad. The next treif you eat, the next violation of Shabbat that you do, the next thing that you steal when no one's looking, oilo, what was to you? Not only shehichriya et atzmo, that you pushed yourself over the line, but v'et kol ha'olam lekaf chova. You might be the one who pushed the whole world. It's probably thinking of the whole Jewish world towards wickedness. Shene Amar, quoting from the same verse in Kohelet, v'chote echad ya'abed tova harbeh. B'shvil chet yichedi she'asa zeh, because of one measly sin, you thought it was a nothing. You thought it was a zero. There is no such thing as a zero in this rabbinic theology. Everything is a thing that can turn your own reality and the world's reality to the negative. Avad mimenu mikol ha'olam tova harbeh. You lost for yourself and for the whole world much goodness. Yet a third teaching, right in a row, on Masechet Kiddushin. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, famous sage, Lag BaOmer, etc. Afilu tzadik gamur kol yamav. Even if you were the most righteous dude your entire life, this is now going to be the one that brings us back to the Rambam's teaching. Umarad ba'achrona. At the last second you said, this was ridiculous. I lived my life with restraint. I gave up hedonistic pleasures. I gave up the things I really wanted to do for some imaginary God in the sky. You go through a rebellion at the very end of your life. Ibeid et harishonot shene'amar. You lost all of your righteousness. This is the flip of the things the Rambam brings. The Rambam doesn't bring this one. This is the flip of it. You lost all of the chips that you had gained from your righteousness. Quoting the same chapter of Ezekiel, but just earlier on, Tzidkat HaTzadik, the righteousness of the righteous person, Lo Tatzilenu, will not save that person, B'yom Pisho, or Yom Posho, on the day of his transgression. And now we get the one that the Rambam is basing his teaching on, V'afilu Rasha Gamur Kol Yamav. Let's say you are a complete scoundrel your entire life. V'asa Tshuva V'achrona, and you did tshuva at the very end. This is going to sound almost exactly like what the Rambam said. Ein mazkirin lo shuv risho. You, the the person observing that are never allowed to mention to that person or taunt that person of his previous wickedness. Shenemar, as it says in this next verse in Yechezkel, Urishat harasha lo yikashel ba b'yom shuva mirosho. The wickedness of the wicked person will not make him stumble on the day that he turns. The reason I wanted you to see this is that I wanted you to see it as the third piece of a three-part rabbinic theology that suggests that individual actions matter enormously to your ledger. They matter enormously to the world's ledger, and therefore it might flow more logically that since the power of the next deed is so powerful, it may even be able to reverse in either direction your entire kind of spiritual life story up until that point. And the Rambam lifts just the second part of part 3 and throws it into his Hilkhot Teshuvah. It's interesting to ask why he doesn't include, at least not in this section, the first part of part 3 that says, even if you were righteous your entire life, one sin will turn it all around. Okay, let me pause here and see if there are thoughts or comments because we're almost at the end of our time, and I still haven't decided of the enormously good material coming up, which is the one I'm going to focus on in our last class next week. And of course, if there's interest, we can do this more after the high holidays. But thoughts, comments, reactions to what we just saw in the Talmud or the Rashi or what it says about the Rambam's text. Going once, Rebecca.
I hope you can hear me now. I'm not sure why the sound wasn't good. But my initial reaction to the parts from the Talmud was that I really don't like that. It goes against everything I try to tell myself, everything I try to tell my kids. You know, you do your homework all semester and then you screw up once. The teacher will accept that. If you know, that shouldn't color everything. But then when I look at this last sentence, I kind of interpret that as maybe it's being seen as all this time before you were a Rasha. But when you return, that day that you return, you're actually starting a new life as a non-Rasha. And so in that respect, it could be that you're looking at a turning point. So if you were good all this time, but now you're rebelling and you're actually really going away from what's right, then what you did well initially doesn't count. Maybe not so much that it's one deed, but that it's the beginning of sort of a new bad phase or a new good phase. That's right. How I like to interpret it.
That's a wonderful interpretation. A cousin to that interpretation is that not only is the beginning of something new, bad or good, that it might be representative of what you always were, but were obscured by poor decision making or playing a part, right? So it might also the Talmud's way of saying, if you did true tshuva at the end, maybe deep inside of you was the good person. You hadn't found it yet, right? And we're going to trust that now that you found it, that's actually going to be the truer you, and we're going to judge you based on you. And the reverse. Now, if you played the part of a righteous person and threw it all away at the end, and again, we can think of righteousness here as like interpersonal righteousness or even religious righteousness. Maybe you weren't such a tzaddik. Maybe you were just trying to impress. Maybe you were parlaying your righteousness into access. Who knows? Maybe this is the truer you, right? So it really is an interesting study on the Talmud's study of what human character is and how malleable and which expression of what a person does should be taken seriously, right? I'll go on a slight tangent and then we'll end the class. Let me try to anonymize this as best as possible. Somewhat recently, I learned of a colleague who I know pretty well, not a close friend, who has lived, from what I can tell, and maybe the things I don't know, a pretty upstanding, exemplary, wonderful, personal, family-based, and rabbinic life. And then was accused and arrested for doing something that is inexcusable. And those of us who know this person are trying to ask ourselves, well, which is the person? Is the person the 45 years that some of us have known him less time of goodness and honesty and tenderness and sweetness, or is the person the one act which cannot be defended? And apparently it's one act that seems to undermine all that. Is a person maybe more complex than we think? Do we have demons lurking that sometimes they break through the epidermis of the character? And if they break through the epidermis of the character and come out, and we have to pay the price for it, does that mean we are now that person, or are we the person who actually has successfully kept our urges, which we all have, in check? And this is the exception that proves the rule. And it's really hard to figure out. And the law has a different way of responding to it than the community, right? So the law might have something very specific to say about that deed, right? And dina de malchuta dina, we live in a society of law. So if the law says that for that deed, it doesn't matter if the person had, righteousness the previous decades, that deed has to be paid for. But how are we supposed to think of who that person is now? Or should we be imagining that a person is unimaginably complex? And I think the Talmud, in some ways, sometimes it's hard to remember that the Talmud was written by real people, observing real people. And while culture and society were different back then, they were really walking through the streets of Jerusalem or Babylonia and Sur and Pampadita, and they were really tempted to steal, and they were really getting into bad moods, and they were really wondering if the laws that they were being asked to observe for Shabbat and Pesach were really that significant. And the rabbinic system was observing all this and trying to figure out what is a human being, and how are we supposed to understand a human being's behaviors, and how should we predict the next thing a human being is going to do based on the previous 10 or 100 or 1,000 things they did. And we still haven't figured it out completely. So I think this is the text trying to reckon with the complexity of a flawed soul, which we all are in possession of. Joanna, you get the final comment of the morning.
My final comment of the morning is I want to quote Rabbi Kligfeld, back to Rabbi Kligfeld from a completely different context. And it's funny because I quoted something that you said in an Elul teaching with this very thing, in an Elul teaching with Rabbi Schatz, and then also some study that I was doing away from Beth Am. And it's an image, obviously, that is
study away from Beth Am? Joanna, how dare you? Go ahead. Sorry.
And it's an image for some reason that's deeply resonating with me this high holiday season. And I don't even remember the sermon and the context of it, but you were talking about binaries and how we tend to think of binaries as opposite ends of a straight line, and put those binaries on a string and now curve that string and make those two ends touch. And, because things that we seemingly on the surface seem to think of as so far apart from each other, maybe are not quite as far apart as we think. And there's just like the tiniest, thinnest sliver of a line that divides them.
Yeah. That image I first heard from my dear friend and teacher, Rabbi Jack Moline, who sometimes watches me on Facebook. So if you're watching, Rabbi Moline, that's you. Yeah, and it's a phenomenal image. And I think it's a much better way of seeing polarity, or at least some polarities in life, right? The difference between the distance between madness and genius, the distance between laughter and tears, and the distance perhaps between a righteous life and a wicked moment, right? They actually might be, kissing cousins on some level, even though they're the opposite ends of the characterological spectrum. And it's humbling to think about, right? Because woe, to paraphrase the Talmud, woe to us if we think we're not capable of such a turnaround in either direction, by the way. Right? So we're capable of enormous turnaround for the good. And, we're not that many steps away from what could push someone to turn around for the negative. And I think that's important and humbling to remember this season as we're supposed to be considering our character and our deeds. So let me end here. Wish you Shabbat Shalom.
And to be aware of the people around us and flaws that they might have that we can help catch prior to them escalating to the point where
Amen
it becomes a negativity.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.